Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're taking a really fascinating, deeply investigative look at the multi-billion-dollar hair transplant industry. Now, from the outside looking in, this field is almost always presented as this modern medical miracle, right? A permanent solution to hair loss. But when we actually start digging into the data, the legal documents, and the underlying corporate practices, a totally different picture emerges. What we're actually unpacking today isn't just a medical procedure. We are looking at a highly organized machine of corporate censorship. It is literally a system built from the ground up to control what you see, what you read, and most importantly, what patients are actually allowed to say.
Okay, let's dive into this. Because look, when a guy undergoes a hair transplant, gets a terrible result, and then bravely shaves his head to expose a massive, wide FUT scar on YouTube or Reddit, and then that video suddenly just vanishes? That didn't happen naturally. It wasn't just him having a sudden change of heart. That disappearance is the result of a highly orchestrated effort. So what we are exploring today is exactly how this corporate matrix operates to make sure that the only stories you ever see online are these absolutely flawless outcomes, completely erasing the very real physical risks of cutting a chunk of skin out of a human skull.
So Section 1, the legal gag machine and pre-review NDAs.
To really understand how this works, we've got to start at the very beginning of the patient journey. Well before a patient ever even sits in the surgeon's chair, they are handed a massive stack of paperwork, and buried deep within that paperwork are pre-service non-disclosure agreements, or NDAs. These contracts are explicitly designed to force patients to pay ruinous financial penalties if they ever show a bad surgical outcome or post a negative review online. So, when you're looking at a clinic's perfectly clean 5-star review page, it is absolutely crucial to understand that you aren't necessarily looking at a track record of perfect surgeries. In many cases, you are looking at a track record of legally terrified patients who literally cannot afford to tell the truth.
$250,000. Now, what's really wild is that this isn't some hypothetical number we made up. This was the actual financial penalty weaponized by corporate entities like Allure Aesthetic, which is a massive cosmetic surgery franchise, against their own patients. Just imagine sitting there with a box surgery, in pain, with a terrible scar, knowing that simply speaking out about your experience could completely bankrupt your family.
Fortunately, we know this suppression is a verified institutional practice because it actually caught the attention of the federal government. The Washington State Attorney General literally sued Allure Aesthetic because they had forced over 10,000 patients to sign these gag orders. The government had to step in because these extreme intimidation tactics directly violate the Federal Consumer Review Fairness Act. So this federal crackdown proves once and for all that the censorship we're talking about, it isn't some internet conspiracy theory. It's a documented, calculated corporate strategy that actually required government intervention to stop.
Moving right along to Section 2, slap lawsuits, or what we can call the legal flying monkeys.
But what happens when brave patients actually bypass those NDAs? What happens if they just post their honest reviews anyway? Well, they face the SLAP lawsuit. That stands for Strategic Lawsuits Against Public Participation. Because when a negative review goes live, these corporate chains don't just reach out to apologize or fix the issue. No, they hire incredibly aggressive law firms. And the whole point of a SLAP lawsuit isn't necessarily to win a defamation case on its medical merits in front of a judge. The true goal is to financially exhaust regular, everyday guys with crushing legal fees until they just give up, cave in, and delete their videos.
Let's look at a very specific real-world precedent here. Signature Clinic, which is a prominent multi-location cosmetic surgery chain, launched a massive wave of aggressive defamation and malicious falsehood lawsuits against multiple former patients. These were just guys who had posted honest, negative reviews about their actual surgical results. But instead of addressing the medical outcomes, the clinic chose to legally bully them into silence.
Let's walk through exactly how this psychological and financial warfare plays out, because the timeline reveals a pretty dark reality. On day 1, the patient posts a review. Fast forward to month 2, and they are suddenly hit with terrifying defamation lawsuits. Now, at this point, most guys would just delete the review right then and there to avoid bankruptcy. But in this specific case, by month 6, the Free Speech Union actually intervened to provide legal backing. And because the patients could finally afford to defend themselves, by year 1, Signature Clinic backed down, settled, and actually had to pay the patient's legal costs. This timeline is so important because it highlights that most regular guys delete their shaved head videos not because they're lying about their scars, but because they simply cannot afford to defend the truth in court.
All right, Section 3, digital flying monkeys and forum manipulation.
Moving beyond the courtroom, there is an entirely different battlefield we have to talk about, and that's internet forums.
When a guy is researching hair transplants, he usually looks for online communities that appear to be these organic, grassroots patient support groups. But the reality? Many of these dedicated forums and subreddits are actually highly monetized corporate gatekeepers. Doctors literally pay massive monthly sponsorship fees to these platforms just to be listed as recommended surgeons. And this pay-to-play structure completely changes how information is moderated.
Which brings us to the mathematical trap that consumers fall into. Let's see how this builds. Step 1. A patient posts an unedited photo of a horribly stretched, glaringly white fute scar from one of these paying doctors. Step 2. The digital flying monkeys, basically paid clinic reps or industry plants, absolutely swarm the thread. They use psychological gaslighting to humiliate the patient, saying absurd things like, well, the surgeon is elite, your body just has poor scalp elasticity, or they'll directly blame the guy for bad aftercare. And then step 3, when the patient gets understandably defensive, the forum quietly locks or deletes the entire thread, claiming it somehow violates community formatting guidelines. Just like that, poof, the negative evidence against a paying sponsor is completely erased, and the forum's advertising revenue is protected.
Which leads us to Section 4, the global volume trap and the industrialization of insecurity.
If we zoom out from the individual forums for a second, we can really see the sheer global scale of this issue. According to data from the Bloomberg investigative documentary on the hair transplant industry, the modern market is heavily optimized for high-volume transactions. In these multi-billion-dollar international hubs, like Istanbul for example, the entire business model relies on churning through patients. Marketing and speed are prioritized way above long-term anatomical safety. It effectively becomes a factory line where getting the absolute maximum number of patients in and out the door is the only real objective.
And fueling this volume trap is a massive marketing engine. We are constantly sold this illusion, celebrity-fueled influencers promising permanent, absolute perfection. But the reality is vastly different. What absolutely no one is talking about is the long-term timeline. After finasteride loses potency and your natural hair begins to thin again, you may not be able to style your hair at all. You're just left with this isolated, unnatural island of transplanted hair on top of your head. Literally no one is talking about this. These influencers are eventually forced to hide these unnatural hairlines off camera because making a public complaint about this long-term reality would instantly ruin their lucrative VIP brand deals. So the cycle of silence just continues, even at the highest influencer levels.
And finally, Section 5, weaponizing human insecurity.
The absolute crucial takeaway here is that this entire ecosystem isn't just about a few bad haircuts. It is a highly coordinated effort to suppress reality, basically gaslighting men by telling them that known long-term surgical risks are somehow their own fault. Which leaves us with a really vital question to consider as we wrap up. What does it actually mean when a multi-billion-dollar industry is built primarily as a silencing machine for human insecurity? When NDAs, aggressive lawsuits, and digital gaslighting become standard operating procedure, we have to critically re-examine every single flawless 5-star cosmetic result we see online. Because behind that perfect image, there might just be an entire matrix of censorship keeping the truth in the dark. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive in The Explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and we'll see you next time.